This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The great hall of the tribunal was a cavern of cold marble and echoing judgment, where the scent of expensive incense mingled with the metallic tang of fear. At the center of this architectural titan sat Emperor Cyrus Valen, a man whose very silhouette was a monument to absolute, unyielding power. His crown, heavy with the blood of ancestors and the weight of 1,000 laws, cast a shadow over eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Yet today they were fixed on a single, trembling figure. Down in the pit of the hall, stripped of her dignity, but not her grace, stood Lyra. She was a ghost in a garden of wolves, her simple tunic torn and her feet bare against the frozen stone that represented the Empire's mercy. The contrast was a physical ache. The man who held the world in his hand looked down upon a woman who had nothing left but the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Thousands watched from the galleries, waiting for the word that would extinguish a life, while Cyrus felt the gold of his throne biting into his palms, for he alone knew the truth that lay hidden beneath the lies. As the High Chancellor's voice droned on, reciting a litany of staged betrayals and forged evidence, the Emperor remained a statue of obsidian. He saw the way Lyra's shoulders didn't slump, the way she held her head with a quiet, terrifying dignity that mocked the opulence surrounding her. Every word of the accusation was a dagger he had sharpened himself through his own inaction, a betrayal far deeper than any political conspiracy. He remembered the secret reports on his desk, the proof of her innocence that he had burned in his private chambers to appease the warring factions of his court. To save her would be to ignite a civil war. To condemn her was to preserve a peace built on a lie. The air in the room grew thin as the moment of sentencing approached, the tension stretching until it was a wire vibrating with the threat of snapping. Cyrus watched her, his breath shallow, waiting for her to scream or beg for her life. But she remained still, a small flame in a rising tide of darkness, her presence a silent scream that echoed louder than any decree. The final decree fell like a guillotine's blade, a sentence of exile and eternal shame that was effectively a slow death in the salt mines of the north. As the guards moved forward to seize her, Lyra didn't look at the crowd or the judges. She raised her eyes and looked directly at the Emperor, piercing through the armor of his indifference. There was no hatred in her gaze, no burning desire for revenge, only a profound and shattering disappointment that seemed to age Cyrus by 100 years in a single heartbeat. In that crystalline second of connection, he saw the reflection of the man he had become, a king who had traded his soul for a crown of thorns. As she was dragged away, her fingertips brushed against the cold floor, leaving a faint mark of dust that felt like a permanent stain on his conscience. He stayed seated long after the hall had emptied, the echo of her silent judgment filling the void where his heart used to be. He had saved his empire today, but he realized with sickening clarity that he had just signed the death warrant of his own humanity. Emperor Cyrus Valen stood by the window, his silhouette framed by a sun that bled over the horizon of Oran. The palace silence felt like a heavy shroud, contrasting with the applause that greeted his cold sentencing of the girl. He traced his signet ring, which felt more like a shackle than a symbol of power. For 2 decades, he had built a wall of ice around his heart, hardened by a past betrayal that left him hollow. To his subjects, he was an impassive statue of justice, yet Lyra's eyes burned behind his eyelids, challenging the foundation of the order he protected through his calculated and cowardly silence. Lyra was never meant for the grandeur of the capital or the cold iron of its prisons. She was the daughter of a simple artisan who shaped beauty from clay until political intrigue destroyed their home. Her life had been one of quiet observation, a sharp deviation from the gray reality she now inhabited. Even as a child, she learned to move like a shadow invisible to the powerful, her only defense being a mind that saw too much. She grew up in the periphery of greatness, considered guilty by association, a stain on the empire's perfect tapestry that the nobility sought to wash away with her innocent blood. In the dead of night, while the city celebrated, Cyrus found himself unable to sleep. The image of Lyra in the tribunal, her gaze fixed on him with soul-crushing disappointment, played on a loop in his mind. He had convinced himself her sacrifice was necessary for the greater good, a political move ensuring his reign's stability. However, the logic that served him for years now felt brittle against the weight of her words. He realized that in his quest to be an infallible ruler, he had become a spectator to his own corruption. The guilt was a slow poison, seeping into his resolve, forcing him to acknowledge the hollow victory of a man who ruled everything but controlled nothing. Lyra sat in her new cell, though it was far more opulent than the dungeons she expected. The walls were draped in silk, yet to her it was merely a gilded cage. She refused the food brought by silent servants, her body rejecting comforts offered by hands that had signed her soul away. Every luxury was an insult, a bribe meant to silence the truth. She felt the heavy gaze of guards, but her mind was miles away, back in her father's workshop where the air smelled of earth and honest labor. Her deepest rejection wasn't for the empire's cruelty, but for the man who sat on the throne and watched her fall without moving a finger. Driven by an impulse he couldn't name, Cyrus went to the secluded wing where Lyra was held. He stood outside her door, his hand hovering over the latch, trembling with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in decades. When he finally entered, the sight of her small, defiant form hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to explain the politics and the impossible choice, but the words died in his throat as she looked through him. Her silence was a wall more impenetrable than any fortress he had conquered. In that moment, the Emperor understood that while he held her life in his hands, she was the only one who possessed any real power or moral clarity. This story is just beginning, and the weight of this silence will change everything. If you can feel the tension between power and truth, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to follow this journey. Comment below what you would do in the Emperor's place. Would you choose the crown or a single innocent life? Cyrus Valen was not born with a heart of stone. He was forged in the white-hot furnace of high treason and the bitter disloyalty of those he cherished most. Years ago, as a young prince, he witnessed his own mentors selling the kingdom's secrets for mere handfuls of silver. A traumatic event that left him emotionally amputated. He learned early that trust was a luxury the powerful could never afford, and that any vulnerability would lead to the collapse of his entire empire. This heritage transformed him into a ruler who valued cold logic above empathy, believing that impartial justice was the only path to avoid chaos. In stark contrast, Lyra spent her youth surrounded by the constant warmth of a potter's wheel and the earthy scent of damp clay in her father's humble workshop. Her world was small, intimate, and built upon the honest labor of creating beauty from the earth until greedy tax collectors of the empire targeted her family. Her father was accused of hiding riches he never possessed, a cruel lie that grew until it became a formal charge of treason against the crown. Lyra watched her father's spirit break long before his body did, learning that for the powerful, people like her were merely disposable tools or inconvenient obstacles. Standing on the high balcony of his private study, Cyrus watched the flickering lights of the capital, feeling the crushing weight of the crown pressing against his tired, lonely temples. He was surrounded by advisors who whispered constant poison into his ears, and ambitious generals who sought personal glory at the expense of common lives. The solitude of the throne was an absolute, suffocating presence that he had accepted as his final destiny. He always believed his isolation was a necessary sacrifice for the stability of Orin, but the persistent memory of Lyra's eyes began to erode his convictions, making him question if the peace was truly worth her suffering. Within the isolated pavilion that served as her prison, Lyra moved with a ghostly, silent grace, deliberately ignoring the fine silks and delicacies provided for her comfort. She understood that these gifts were not acts of genuine kindness, but the manifestations of a guilty man desperately trying to buy his own emotional absolution. She spent her days staring at the horizon beyond the golden bars, her stillness being an invisible weapon she used to protect what remained of her wounded soul. Every time she heard the heavy footsteps of guards, she was reminded of the injustice that defined her life, refusing to accept charity from the man who destroyed her. When Cyrus visited her for the second time, he brought an ancient book of poetry, hoping words could build a bridge over the vast abyss of resentment between them. He stood in the room, his majestic presence filling the space. Yet he felt strangely small under the steady, accusing gaze of his prisoner. He offered the book with a gesture of unusual hesitation, a rare lapse in his always impeccable, cold posture. Lyra did not move to receive it. She simply looked at the offering and then returned to the window, her rejection being absolute. The Emperor finally realized that his immense power meant nothing in this small room. Emperor Cyrus spent his evenings in a library that smelled of old parchment and cold stone, a place where the history of his ancestors weighed more than the air itself. Every book on these shelves spoke of conquests and rigid codes, the very foundations of the empire he had sacrificed his humanity to preserve. He traced the spine of a volume on ancient law, wondering when the ink of justice had turned into the blood of the vulnerable. Was a ruler truly powerful if his decrees were built upon the silence of his conscience and the suffering of the innocent? The throne had promised him absolute control, yet as he stared into the dying embers of the hearth, he realized he was the most bound man in his entire kingdom. Lyra lay on the silk sheets that felt like ice against her skin, her mind retreating to the dusty warmth of her father's workshop. She could still hear the rhythmic hum of the potter's wheel and the way the sunlight used to filter through the cracks in the wooden ceiling. That life was a dream now, shattered by the heavy boots of the Imperial Guard and the cold indifference of a courtroom that had already decided her fate. She remembered the moment the Emperor's eyes met hers, how he had looked away as if her existence were a mere clerical error. The physical walls of her prison were nothing compared to the crushing weight of being judged for a crime she never committed by a man who knew the truth. From a hidden gallery overlooking the garden where Lyra was allowed to walk, Cyrus watched her every movement with a hunger he could not explain. She did not pace like a caged animal, nor did she weep like the broken women he had seen in the courts of his rivals. She moved with a quiet, devastating grace, her hands occasionally reaching out to touch a leaf or a stone as if seeking a connection to something real. He wondered what she saw when she looked at the sky. Did she see a vast expanse of freedom or another layer of his suffocating authority? Her resilience was a silent accusation that echoed through the corridors of his mind, making his crown feel like a band of burning iron. Every morning, Cyrus sent a tray of the finest fruits and honeyed breads to her chambers, a pathetic attempt to soften the blow of her captivity. And every morning, the servants returned the tray untouched, the food as pristine and cold as the Emperor's heart. He even tried to send her the finest wools and dyes, thinking she might find solace in the craft that had been stolen from her. But Lyra would not be bought with the currency of her captor. She left the gifts in the corner like discarded debris. Her refusal was not a shout, but a whisper that carried more weight than a declaration of war, proving that no amount of gold could bridge the gap created by his initial betrayal. As the moon rose over the jagged peaks of the Oran Mountains, a chilling realization settled over the emperor, like a winter frost. He had thought that by keeping her close, he could somehow manage his guilt, turning her into a living monument to his secret mercy. Instead, her presence was a haunting melody that disrupted every thought and every decree he tried to sign. He found himself standing before her door once more, the key heavy in his hand and his heart beating with a rhythm that defied his royal training. He was about to step into a fire that would either consume his reign or finally melt the ice that had protected him for so long. Emperor Cyrus began to conduct his daily affairs from the sun-drenched terrace adjacent to Lyra's chambers, a move that sent ripples of confusion through his court. He sat at a heavy oak table, surrounded by maps and petitions, yet his attention was constantly drawn to the figure sitting by the fountain just a few paces away. It was a tactical excuse to be near her, a way to normalize their presence in each other's orbits, without the pressure of direct conversation. He wanted her to see the burden of his rule, the endless decisions that cost lives, hoping she might find a grain of understanding within the cold logic of his administration. Lyra treated his presence as if he were a ghost, a lingering shadow that had no business haunting her small patch of sun. She would sit for hours with her back to him, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns in her dress, refusing to acknowledge the power he wielded just behind her. Yet she could hear the scratch of his quill and the weary sighs that escaped him when the reports were particularly grim. Despite her anger, she began to notice the human cost of his crown, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. It was a dangerous realization, for it threatened to humanize the man she vowed to loathe. One afternoon, a sudden gust of wind scattered a stack of critical military documents across the terrace, some of them fluttering dangerously close to the garden's edge. Without a word or a thought, Lyra rose and gathered the papers, her movements fluid and instinctual, before she could remind herself to remain indifferent. As she handed them back to him, their fingertips brushed for a fleeting, electric second, a contact that felt like a bolt of lightning through their shared isolation. Cyrus looked up, startled by the proximity, and for the first time, he saw not a prisoner, but a woman whose touch carried a warmth he had forgotten existed in his frozen world. Emboldened by that momentary connection, Cyrus began to speak into the silence, his voice low and gravelly, narrating the difficult choices he faced each day. He spoke of the famine in the western provinces and the treacherous whispers of his generals, treating her as a silent confessor for the sins of his reign. He didn't ask for her opinion or her forgiveness, but the act of sharing his burdens felt like a release of a pressure he had carried alone for years. Lyra remained still, yet she listened to every word, her heart warring between the memory of his betrayal and the growing weight of his unexpected honesty. As the sun dipped below the palace walls, casting long purple shadows over the terrace, the tension between them shifted from hostility to a fragile, unspoken understanding. Cyrus watched her silhouette, noticing how the light caught the loose strands of her hair, and for a moment he forgot he was an emperor, and she was his victim. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to reach out and tell her he was sorry, but the words were still too heavy for a man who had never learned to apologize. Instead, he simply stayed in the silence with her, allowing the cooling air to wrap around them, a small, quiet victory against the cold. The days began to melt into a predictable rhythm of shared, yet distant solitude. Cyrus would arrive each morning with his ledgers and scrolls, choosing a seat that allowed him to observe Lyra without directly confronting her. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, a heavy atmosphere that hummed with the vibration of two souls slowly adjusting to each other's gravity. He found himself dressing with more care, not for his court, but for the quiet scrutiny he felt from her corner of the garden. He was the master of all he surveyed, yet he waited for her presence like a beggar waits for the rain. One morning, he did not bring books or maps, but a simple wooden crate filled with fine, moist clay from the riverbeds of the distant south. He placed it near the fountain where she usually sat, his movements deliberate and devoid of his usual imperial arrogance. It was a humble offering, a piece of the world she had been forced to leave behind, far more valuable than any silk or gemstone. He did not say a word as he set it down, but his eyes lingered on her hands, which were idle and pale against her dark skirts. He was offering her a chance to remember her true self. Lyra stared at the gray mound of earth for a long time after he had returned to his table. The scent of the damp clay was a visceral trigger, bringing back the ghost of her father's laughter and the sound of the evening crickets in their village. Her heart ached with a mixture of longing and fury that he would dare to use her own craft to reach her. Yet the urge to create was a hunger that outweighed her pride, and eventually her fingers dipped into the cool, malleable surface. As she began to knead the clay, the wall she had built around herself started to show its first fractures. Cyrus watched from the periphery, his quill forgotten as he witnessed the transformation of her posture. When she worked the clay, the defensive tension in her shoulders vanished, replaced by a focused, rhythmic grace that captivated him more than any courtly dance. He saw the artisan's soul emerging from the prisoner's shadow, a sight so pure it made the politics of his reign feel like ash in his mouth. He found himself speaking softly, not of wars or taxes, but of the simple things he had once loved. The smell of the forest after a storm. He was no longer just an emperor, he was a man seeking a reflection. Their fragile peace was shattered when a high-ranking minister entered the garden, his voice booming with a disdainful remark about the peasant girl's mess cluttering the imperial grounds. The man's arrogance was a reflection of the very court Cyrus had cultivated, a cold reminder of the world that had condemned her. Before Lyra could even flinch, Cyrus rose with a lethal, quiet intensity that silenced the entire garden in a heartbeat. He did not shout, but the icy edge in his voice as he dismissed the minister was a shield he had never before raised for anyone. He realized he would destroy his own court to protect her peace. The dismissal of the minister left an echo of authority that resonated through the damp garden air, changing the very nature of their shared silence. For the first time, Lyra did not see the emperor as a distant mountain of ice, but as a man who could strike like a serpent to protect her fragile dignity. Cyrus sat back down, but he did not return to his ledgers. His eyes remained on the small bowl she had begun to shape from the river clay. He noticed that her movements had slowed, her fingers hesitating over the rim of the vessel as she processed the sudden shield he had cast over her. As the evening approached, a heavy gray shroud of clouds rolled over the Oran peaks, bringing with it a sudden biting wind that heralded a mountain storm. The rain began as a soft patter against the marble but quickly intensified into a deafening roar, forcing them to retreat from the open terrace into the warmth of the pavilion's interior. The space was smaller, more intimate, and the scent of damp earth followed them inside as the thunder rolled like a warning through the corridors. In the flickering light of the hearth, the vast distance that usually separated their social standing seemed to evaporate, leaving only two people seeking shelter from the chaos outside. Cyrus noticed Lyra shivering slightly in her thin tunic, her hands still stained with the drying remnants of the gray clay she had been working earlier. Instead of calling for a servant, he moved toward the fireplace himself, kneeling to stoke the embers until they roared into a comforting, golden blaze. It was a task beneath his station, an act that stripped him of his imperial veneer and left him vulnerable in his own palace. He then produced a small, silver jar of scented balm from his desk, setting it quietly on the table near her chair without a word. He wanted to care for the hands that created beauty, even if he couldn't yet fix the heart he had broken. Lyra looked at the silver jar, and then at the man who had sat in judgment of her father and herself, her curiosity finally outweighing her vow of silence. She asked him softly if the weight of the crown was truly so heavy that it required him to crush everyone beneath it just to keep from falling. Her voice was like the first note of a song after a long winter, catching him completely off guard with its clarity and lack of malice. She wasn't asking for her freedom or for his head on a platter. She was asking why a man with everything felt the need to live with absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding laws. Cyrus looked into the fire, the orange light dancing in his tired eyes as he debated how much of his wounded soul he was willing to reveal to his prisoner. He told her of the night he had been forced to execute his own mentor, the man who had taught him to ride and read because of a plot he hadn't seen coming. He explained that from that moment on, he decided that feeling nothing was safer than feeling too much and being betrayed again. His words were a confession, a stripping away of the Emperor's mask to show the scarred and lonely boy who still lived within the fortress of his power. The fire continued to crackle between them, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the rigid lines of the imperial architecture. Cyrus felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if the weight of his secret had been a stone he finally set down at her feet. He watched her carefully, waiting for the rejection or the mockery that he had spent half his life guarding against. But Lyra did not laugh. She simply sat there, her presence a calm harbor in the storm. The silence was no longer a weapon of war between them, but a shared breath, a mutual recognition that transcended the titles of emperor and condemned. Lyra reached out and picked up the silver jar of balm, her fingers trembling slightly as she unscrewed the lid. The scent of lavender and sandalwood filled the small space, a luxury that felt entirely foreign to the rough, calloused skin of an artisan. She began to rub the cream into her knuckles, her eyes never leaving the flickering flames as she processed the Emperor's confession. She saw now that his coldness was not strength, but a sophisticated form of hiding, a fortress built to protect a spirit shattered long before her own. The man who sat before her was as much a prisoner of his past as she was of his laws. Without thinking, she dipped her hand back into the clay, her movements guided by a new, softer energy that she hadn't felt since the trial. She began to shape a small, simple figure, not a bowl or a jar, but the likeness of a bird in flight, its wings stretched wide against an invisible wind. Cyrus leaned forward, drawn in by the rhythmic dance of her mud-stained fingers, marveling at how something so beautiful could emerge from such humble materials. He realized that while he could build monuments of marble and gold, he could never create something that breathed with the life and soul she poured into the earth. It was a silent lesson in power. Outside the pavilion, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of disturbance was taking root within the palace walls. The servants whispered in the shadows about the Emperor's long absences and the way he looked at the girl who was supposed to be a stain on his reputation. The court was a nest of vipers, and they were beginning to notice that their king was no longer the predictable, frozen statue they had learned to manipulate. Rumors of his weakness began to spread like a slow-acting poison through the noble houses, fueled by the sight of the imperial seal sitting neglected on a table of wet clay. His humanity was now a threat. Cyrus stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass, his reflection ghost-like against the dark night. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to open the doors and tell Lyra she was free to go, to return to the life he had stolen from her. But he knew that the moment she stepped outside these walls, the vipers of the court would tear her apart just to strike at him. He was trapped in a paradox where his protection was her prison, and his affection was a death sentence for them both. He turned back, his heart heavy with the realization they were watched. The fragile peace was shattered the following morning by the arrival of High Chancellor Vane, a man whose soul was as dry as the parchment he carried. He entered without an invitation, his heavy silk robe sweeping across the floor like the wings of a scavenger bird. Vane's eyes, sharp and calculating, darted between the Emperor's weary face and the girl who sat with clay-stained hands near the hearth. The air, once warm and intimate, instantly froze into a landscape of political danger. Vane's presence was a cold reminder that the law was an unblinking eye that never truly slept, demanding that every debt to the state be paid in full. Cyrus felt the iron mask of his office sliding back into place, a heavy, familiar weight that extinguished the light in his eyes. He stood tall, his voice reclaiming the hollow tone of a ruler who commanded legions, yet his heart felt squeezed by a giant's fist. He spoke to Vane with a coldness that made the Chancellor blink, asserting his absolute authority over the girl's custody. Every syllable was a lie told to protect her, a verbal armor to hide the fact that he was no longer the master of his desires. He was playing a dangerous game with the very foundations of his ancient and blood-soaked reign. Lyra watched the transformation of the man who had just shared his soul, seeing him revert into the monster who had condemned her. The warmth of the firelight seemed to vanish, replaced by the clinical gray light of the imperial court. She felt a sharp, bitter pang of betrayal, realizing that the vulnerability he showed her was a luxury he could discard at any moment. Her fingers curled around the clay bird she had fashioned, wanting to crush it. She realized that no matter how much they talked, he was still the Emperor, and she was still the prisoner of a man who loved his power more. Vane produced a scroll signed by the heads of the 12 noble houses, a collective demand that the law be upheld and the girl be moved to the mines. The document was a declaration of war, a sign that the nobility sensed a weakness in their emperor. They spoke of tradition and the purity of the legal code, but Cyrus heard the underlying threat of a coup behind every word. He knew that if he refused, he would be painting a target on Lyra's back that no amount of palace guards could protect. The walls of his golden fortress were finally beginning to crumble around his feet. After Vane departed, the silence that returned was no longer a comfort, but a suffocating pressure that made it hard for either of them to breathe. Cyrus turned to look at Lyra, his face a mask of stone, yet his eyes were filled with a desperate, unspoken apology. He realized that his attempt to save her in the shadows had only made her a more visible target for those who hungered for his throne. The fear of losing her was a sharp blade at his throat, a sensation he had never known. He had never allowed himself to care for anything until this very moment. The Chancellor's threat lingered in the room like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Cyrus paced the length of the hall, the sound of his boots echoing against the marble like the ticking of a doomsday clock. He knew the noble houses weren't just asking for Lyra's punishment. They were testing the fabric of his resolve and his fitness to wear the crown. To protect her openly was to invite a rebellion that would drench the city in blood. But to surrender her was to destroy the only piece of himself that felt alive. His hands shook with a rage that had no target but his own heart. Lyra watched him from the shadows of the hearth, the clay bird she had crafted sitting forgotten on the table. She understood now that she was not just a prisoner, but a pawn in a game far larger and deadlier than a simple craftsman's daughter could ever imagine. The Emperor's sudden coldness wasn't a betrayal of their connection, but a desperate armor he was forced to wear against his own ministers. She felt a strange, cold clarity settle over her, as she realized her life was the currency they were using to buy political stability. The luxuries surrounding her felt like a shroud, and she found herself wishing for the honest danger of the streets. Beyond the pavilion, the palace transformed into a hive of whispered conspiracies and sharp glances. Every servant and guard was a potential spy for the High Chancellor, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the coming change of tide. Cyrus was forced to return to the Great Hall, sitting on his throne for hours as he parried the veiled attacks of men who had once been his allies. They spoke of the law as if it were a living god that demanded a sacrifice, and they watched him with the eyes of hungry wolves. He felt the isolation of the summit more acutely than ever, a king surrounded by enemies. That night, Cyrus returned to the pavilion, not as a ruler, but as a man who was drowning in his own choices. He did not speak of the chancellor or the scrolls, but he sat closer to Lyra than he ever had before, the distance between them shrinking to a mere heartbeat. He watched her work the clay with a frantic intensity, her fingers moving with a desperate need to create something permanent in a world that was falling apart. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, stilling her movements and grounding her in the present moment. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, a silent promise to fight for her survival. However, even as their hands touched, the heavy sound of marching boots sounded in the courtyard outside, a rhythm that was too organized to be a simple patrol. The noble houses had not waited for his answer. They had sent the imperial guard to enforce the decree themselves, bypassing the emperor's personal authority. Cyrus stood up, his sword half drawn, a look of lethal determination crossing his face as he realized the coup had already begun. He looked at Lyra, seeing the fear in her eyes, and knew that the time for silence was officially over. The war for the soul of the empire had arrived at her very doorstep today. The heavy doors of the pavilion groaned under the weight of an authority that no longer fully belonged to the man sitting inside. Cyrus stood as a wall of living iron, his hand white-knuckled upon the hilt of his ancestral blade, as the commander of the Imperial Guard stepped into the flickering light. These were men Cyrus had personally trained, soldiers who had once sworn their lives to his service. Yet their eyes were now clouded by the rigid, unthinking dictates of the High Chancellor's law. The air turned brittle with the scent of impending violence, a sharp contrast to the soft, earthy smell of the clay. Lyra felt the sudden, cold realization that her existence had become a poison to the very man who was trying to save her from the shadows. She looked at the Emperor's broad back, seeing the heavy tension in his shoulders, and realized that her presence was the catalyst for his potential destruction. Every step the guards took closer was a reminder that her life was a debt the Empire intended to collect, regardless of the truth or the Emperor's hidden mercy. A wave of suffocating guilt washed over her, making her wonder if it would be kinder to step forward and surrender rather than watch him burn his legacy. The commander spoke with a voice that was hollow and rehearsed, citing the ancient protocols of the tribunal that allowed the council to override a sovereign's stay of execution during times of perceived instability. Cyrus did not move an inch, his gaze a lethal promise of retribution that made the seasoned soldiers hesitate at the threshold of the room. He reminded them that he was the law made flesh, the source of all their power, and that any hand raised against his prisoner was a hand raised against the crown itself. The standoff was a silent, agonizing war of wills, where a single nervous breath could ignite a massacre. Realizing that he could not win a siege within his own bedchambers, Cyrus signaled for his most loyal shadow guard to step from the tapestries and escort Lyra toward the hidden catacombs beneath the pavilion floor. The look he gave her was one of desperate, frantic longing, a silent plea for her to survive even if it meant they were separated by miles of stone and secret passages. He saw the flicker of terror in her eyes as she was pulled away from the heat of the fire toward the cold, dark unknown of the palace depths. The physical distance growing between them felt like a literal tearing of his own skin. As the secret door clicked shut, leaving him alone to face the line of armored men, Cyrus felt a terrifying, liberating sense of loss wash over his weary soul. He no longer cared about the maps on his table, the gold in his vaults, or the legacy of 100 ancestors who had sat upon the throne before him. The only thing that mattered was the safety of the woman who had taught him how to feel the warmth of the sun again after 20 years of winter. He drew his sword fully now, the steel singing a mournful note in the quiet room, as he prepared to lose everything. The silence that followed the closing of the secret door was louder than any battle cry he had ever heard. Cyrus stood in the center of the pavilion, his sword lowered but his spirit a roaring furnace of defiance and grief. The smell of the damp clay on the table seemed to mock his imperial grandeur, a humble reminder of the woman who had managed to pierce his armor of ice. He looked at the commander and his men, seeing only the hollow instruments of a law that had become a parasite on his own life. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting long, lonely shadows that stretched across the floor like the ghosts of his many regrets. Commander, you stand in the private sanctum of your sovereign, and you do so with steel drawn and a heart full of treachery, Cyrus said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the soldier's armor rattle. He didn't need to strike them to make them bleed. His words were honed by decades of absolute command and a newfound, desperate purpose. He saw the hesitation in their eyes, the flickering shadow of their old loyalty warring against the new orders from the High Chancellor. The room felt smaller, more pressurized, as if the very walls were closing in to witness the moment the Empire's mask finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Meanwhile, Lyra was being led through the labyrinthine darkness of the palace's hidden veins, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps that echoed against the weeping stone walls. The Shadow Guard was a silent, relentless phantom ahead of her, his presence offering no comfort, only the cold promise of survival at the cost of her identity. She felt the weight of the mountain above her, a literal representation of the power that had always sought to bury her beneath its crushing indifference. She wondered if Cyrus was still standing, or if the man who had looked at her with such sudden, raw vulnerability had been swallowed by the wolves of his own court. The commander eventually stepped back, not out of respect, but because a messenger arrived with an urgent summons from the High Council that could not be ignored. Cyrus was forced to sheathe his blade, though his fingers remained curled into tight, trembling fists as he was escorted toward the great hall like a criminal in his own house. He walked through the corridors he had known since childhood, yet every tapestry and statue felt like a stranger's property, a collection of cold trophies from a life he no longer recognized. The fear of what would happen if the Chancellor's spies found the catacombs was a cold blade pressing against his spine. As he reached the massive oak doors of the council chamber, Cyrus paused, closing his eyes to summon the ghost of Lyra's quiet strength to bolster his own failing resolve. He was about to step into a den of vipers, where every word would be a trap and every silence a confession of his hidden heart. The physical distance between him and the girl in the tunnels felt like an infinite abyss, a separation that threatened to undo the very logic of his existence. He pushed the doors open, his face a mask of obsidian, but inside, he was screaming for the woman he had sent into the dark to save his own soul. The council chamber was a pit of vipers dressed in silk and gold, their eyes gleaming with the predatory hunger of men who smelled blood in the water. High Chancellor Vane stood at the podium, his voice like the grinding of dry bones as he laid out the formal charges of imperial obstruction against Cyrus. The Emperor sat on the lesser throne, the cold wood biting into his spine, as he watched his closest allies avert their gazes in a calculated display of collective betrayal. He realized then that the law he had spent his entire life upholding was being used as a garrote to strangle the very last remnants of his personal freedom. Amidst the shouting and the formal accusations, a weathered ledger was produced, a piece of evidence seized from the ruins of Lyra's father's workshop that changed the color of the room entirely. Vane intended it to prove her conspiracy, but as the clerk read the entries aloud, The truth emerged like a jagged bone through skin. Lyra had not been plotting against the crown. She had been secretly funneling the meager profits of her craft to pay the debts of other families targeted by the Chancellor's corrupt tax collectors. She had remained silent during her trial not to hide her own guilt, but to protect dozens of innocent families from the Empire's retaliatory wrath. The revelation struck Cyrus with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless in the suffocating heat of the chamber. He looked at the men around him, men who spoke of honor and stability while they bled the poor dry, and felt a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm his composure. Lyra had stood in the pit of that very hall, accepting a sentence of death and exile to keep others from suffering the same fate, while he had sat in high silence, protecting a throne that was rotting from within. Her dignity was not a shield. It was a mirror reflecting the absolute moral bankruptcy of his entire reign and his own cowardice. Deep beneath the marble foundations, Lyra moved through the weeping catacombs, her fingers brushing the cold, damp walls as the shadow guard urged her forward into the lightless void. Every step away from the pavilion felt like a betrayal of the strange, fragile connection she had built with the man who had once been her executioner. She could hear the muffled echoes of the city above, a reminder that the world was still turning while her life was being erased by the very shadows that were supposed to save her. She stopped, refusing to move another inch into the darkness, realizing that hiding was just another form of the silence that had already cost her everything. Back in the Great Hall, Vane sensed the shift in the room's energy and moved to deliver the final, crushing blow to Cyrus's authority. He declared that the Emperor's refusal to surrender the prisoner was proof of a mind corrupted by sentiment, rendering him unfit to execute the sacred laws of the Empire. The guards at the doors shifted their grip on their pikes, their loyalty fraying under the weight of the Chancellor's bold and treasonous words. Cyrus rose to his feet, his shadow looming large and terrifying against the tapestries. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the crown he was about to lose. Cyrus stood at the precipice of his own undoing, the air in the chamber feeling like a tomb he had built with his own hands. The ledger's revelation had stripped away the last layer of his justification, leaving his soul exposed before the men he had once called peers. He looked at Vane's face and saw the monster he had become by allowing such cruelty to flourish. Lyra's silence wasn't a cloak for treason, but a sanctuary for the innocent, a level of bravery he hadn't possessed in 20 years of hollow rule. The shame was a physical fire, burning through his heart and demanding a reckoning he could no longer avoid. High Chancellor Vane stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant malice that he no longer bothered to hide behind the mask of legalism. He pointed a finger at the Emperor, calling for the guards to seize the man who had supposedly betrayed the very bloodline he was sworn to protect. The councillors whispered in a panicked chorus, their voices blending into a cacophony of fear and greed that filled the vaulted ceiling. Cyrus did not reach for his sword this time. Instead, he reached for the crown upon his head, the gold feeling more repulsive than a shackle of rusted iron. The room held its collective breath as the symbol of power tilted in his grasp. Beneath the floorboards, in the damp chill of the stone passages, Lyra stopped her retreat and pushed back against the guard who tried to pull her deeper into the dark. She could hear the muffled roar of the crowd above, a sound like a distant sea crashing against a cliff, and she knew the man who had tried to save her was being torn apart. To run now would be to accept the role of a victim once again, to let her silence remain a weapon for the corrupt. She pulled her hand away from her guide, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination that no prison or decree could ever hope to extinguish. Cyrus spoke then, not with the resonance of a monarch, but with the broken, honest voice of a man who had finally found his lost humanity in the ruins of his reign. He confessed to every act of cowardice, Every moment he had chosen the stability of the throne over the life of an innocent girl whose only crime was kindness. He told the council that their laws were nothing but chains forged in the darkness of their own ambition, and that he would no longer be the blacksmith who maintained them. The revelation of his complicity was a jagged blade that cut through the hall, leaving the High Lords staring in terrified silence. With a final, deliberate movement, Cyrus removed the crown and let it fall to the marble floor with a hollow, ringing sound that echoed like a funeral bell for the old empire. He stood stripped of his title, appearing more powerful than he ever had when he was draped in the weight of his royal silks. He looked at Vane, not with hatred, but with a profound pity for a man who still believed that gold and stone could satisfy the hunger of a human soul. He turned his back on the throne and walked toward the secret passage, his mind focused solely on finding the woman he had sent into the cold shadows. The sound of the falling crown still vibrated in the air as Cyrus plunged into the hidden depths of the palace, leaving the wreckage of his former life. Behind him, the great hall erupted into a storm of shouting and clashing steel, as Vane's voice shrieked for the arrest of the man who was now a traitor to his own bloodline. The corridors were a blur of flickering torchlight and cold stone. Yet Cyrus ran with a frantic need. He didn't care about the gold he had forfeited. He only cared about the girl currently wandering the lightless veins of the earth because of his silence. In the damp heart of the catacombs, Lyra turned back toward the source of the distant thunder, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She met Cyrus in a narrow passage where the air smelled of ancient dust and forgotten sorrows, their collision a frantic tangle of silk and clay-stained linen. In the dim light of a dying torch, they stared at each other, the immense distance of their social stations finally erased by the shared terror of the hunt. Cyrus reached out, his hands trembling as they cupped her face, searching for the life he had nearly extinguished. For a heartbeat, the world stopped, leaving only the sound of their breath. The moment of peace was shattered by the heavy rhythmic beat of iron boots against the stone floor, signaling that Vane's hunters were closing in. Cyrus pulled Lyra behind him, standing as a solitary shield in the narrow space, his body a living barricade against the forces he once led. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing clarity that spoke of 1,000 unspoken apologies and a single, burning promise. He knew this tunnel might become their shared tomb, yet there was no trace of the Emperor's frozen fear left in his gaze. He was a man prepared to bleed for the truth he found in her grace. Between gasping breaths and the approaching clatter of steel, Cyrus told her of the ledger and the selfless secret she kept to protect the families of the poor. He spoke of his own shame, admitting her silence was the most courageous act he had ever witnessed in his hollow years on the throne. The revelation of his cowardice hung in the cold air between them, a painful admission that couldn't be undone, but could finally be acknowledged. He begged her to understand he wasn't saving her to redeem his crown, but his soul, which was lost long before they met. Lyra listened, her tears tracing clean paths through the clay on her cheeks. The first of the guards rounded the corner, their torches casting long, flickering shadows that danced like demons against the damp walls of the underground passage. Lyra did not shrink back or cower in the darkness. Instead, she reached out and gripped the sleeve of the man who had once been her judge. In that final, definitive choice, she decided the Emperor who had watched in silence was dead, and the man standing before her was someone worth fighting for. They stood together in the narrow tunnel, a fallen king and an artisan's daughter, facing the might of an empire with nothing but their shared truth. The path was only through the fire. The lead guardsman stopped, his torchlight trembling as he recognized the man standing in the shadows of the catacombs. It was one thing to follow a chancellor's orders in the bright, impersonal light of the council chamber, but quite another to raise a blade against the living legend who had led them through a dozen wars. Cyrus didn't speak a single word of command. He simply stood before Lyra, his feet planted wide on the ancient stone, his silhouette a defiant wall of bone and muscle. The silence that had once been his weapon of condemnation had now become a shield of absolute protection, a vow written in the very air between them. When the first soldier lunged, driven more by fear than by conviction, the clash of steel against steel rang out with a mournful, jarring sound that echoed through the narrow veins of the earth. Cyrus fought with a savage, desperate grace that lacked the cold precision of his former sparring matches, for every strike was fueled by the memory of the girl's silent disappointment in the courtroom. He took a shallow cut across his shoulder, the crimson stain blooming rapidly against his fine linen tunic, but he did not move an inch from his post. He was a man shredding the last remnants of his royal dignity to pay a debt that could only be settled in blood. Lyra watched him from the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs as she witnessed the literal dismantling of the great emperor. Every time a blade whistled near him, she felt a phantom pain in her own chest, a realization that he was willingly bleeding for a life he had once considered a mere statistic. She didn't cower behind him like a helpless victim. She gathered heavy stones from the crumbling masonry, ready to strike if the line broke. She saw the sweat and the strain on his face, the way his jaw was set in a permanent line of agony, and she knew that the man who had watched her in silence was truly gone. The guards began to falter, their formations breaking as they looked into the eyes of a ruler who had abandoned his crown for the sake of a peasant girl's survival. In his eyes, they didn't see the coldness of the law, but a burning human fire that made their own motives feel small and wretched. Some lowered their weapons, the clatter of steel against the floor sounding like a series of small surrenders in the dark. They had been told they were hunting a traitor, but they realized they were witnessing the only honest act of leadership they had seen in years. The moral authority of the High Chancellor was evaporating with every drop of the Emperor's blood. As the remaining soldiers retreated into the gloom, leaving a heavy copper scent in the air, Cyrus slumped against the damp wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Lyra was at his side in a heartbeat, her clay-stained hands now reaching out to stem the flow of blood from his shoulder, with a piece of her own torn hem. Their eyes met in the flickering torchlight, and for the first time, there was no fear, no judgment, and no power dynamic between them. They were simply two survivors in the dark, bound together by a sacrifice that had finally shattered the walls of the Empire. The silence that followed was no longer a sentence. It was peace. The dawn broke over the mountains of Orin, not with the harsh trumpet of a military conquest, but with a soft golden light that filtered into the mouth of the secret passage. Cyrus and Lyra emerged from the palace into a world that felt strangely new, the air crisp and free of the incense of corruption. He was no longer the great emperor, and his shoulder burned from the blade, but he felt a lightness that the crown had never provided. As they walked toward the distant valley, he looked back at the stone fortress, realizing that the cold man who had lived within those walls was truly dead now. Lyra walked beside him, her steps no longer the hesitant movements of a ghost, but the firm stride of a woman who had reclaimed her own destiny. The clay on her hands had dried into a pale gray, a badge of her artisan soul that she wore with a quiet pride that Cyrus found breathtaking. She didn't need his titles or his gold to be whole. She only needed the truth to be known, and in his blood, she had found her witness. They spoke very little as they descended the rocky paths, for the silence between them had evolved into a shared language of mutual understanding and profound respect. Behind them, the Empire would have to learn to breathe without the suffocating grip of the old laws, for the empty throne was a more powerful statement than 1,000 decrees. The High Chancellor and the noble houses were left with a crown of cold gold and a palace of echoes, while the real power, the power of choice and empathy, had walked out of their gates forever. Rumors of the emperor's transformation would spread through the villages and markets like a wildfire of hope, telling the story of a man who chose a single life over 1,000 years of tradition. The silence had finally shattered. They eventually reached the outskirts of a small village where the earth was rich, and the people were far removed from the poisons of the capital. Cyrus watched as Lyra knelt by a riverbank, her fingers dipping into the mud with a practiced, loving familiarity that made his own heart ache with a strange joy. He realized that his hands, once used only for signing death warrants and holding swords, could learn to build instead of destroy. He sat on the grass beside her, feeling the sun on his face, content to be the man who protected the artist rather than the ruler who judged the human world. As the evening stars began to pierce the velvet sky, Cyrus turned to Lyra, and finally spoke the secret words trapped in his throat since the day of the trial. He didn't ask for her forgiveness, for some wounds are too deep for apologies, but he promised that he would never let the world go silent again when a voice needed to be heard. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the infinite depth of the heavens, and reached out to take his hand in hers, their fingers interlacing in a silent pact. The great emperor had found his empire in her simple, beating, and very honest heart.